So I'm going to just briefly ask all of us to introduce ourselves first. My name's Paddy Dillon. I coordinate the Theatre Green Book initiative. I'm a bespectacled white man with holes in his jumper. I'm in my 50s, but not for very much longer. Hello,
I'm Chloe, and I'm part of the Art and Energy Collective, and I have blonde hair and a very bright orange and white jumper on.
Hello, I'm Kalkidan Legesse. I'm a social entrepreneur and founder of Sancho's and OWNI, both sustainable fashion businesses that I'm excited to speak to everybody about. I am an Ethiopian woman. I've got my afro out today, wearing a white jumper, white shoes and blue trousers.
And the other member of the panel is not sitting around this slightly intimidating boardroom desk. Is on screen, Feimatta.
Hello, I'm Feimatta Conteh. I'm a light-skinned mixed-race woman. I'm wearing glasses and I've got long braids in my hair today, and I'm joining you from Manchester.
Brilliant, thanks very much Feimatta and all of you. So what we're going to do this afternoon is I'm going to talk for a bit, about 15 minutes or so, about the Theatre Green Book, which many of you who aren't part of theatre have heard being mentioned an awful lot today, of course, and about what we've learned around the importance of networks. And then we're going to turn that into a much wider conversation, bringing in other perspectives, other art forms and other voices to it. But I'm going to start by talking a little bit about networks and the Green Book and the theatre sector. We don't have much time in which to respond to the climate emergency. We don't have any money. And also, and this I think is an equally important point, we only have limited energy. What that means is that we need to tackle this crisis, to do whatever we can do and are going to do in the most streamlined, in the most effective way possible. We can't have days like this unless outcomes come from them, unless we do things differently as a result of them, because there's no longer time for that. In the Theatre Green Book, which we started putting together in lockdown in 2020, we've learned, we think, an awful lot about change and how to make change and how to change systems. And so, with apologies to the theatre people in the room, but for the benefit of everyone else, I'm just going to give a slight sort of introduction to how that came about, which was really from a point where, having conversations with people across theatre, and I don't believe that any other cultural sector is different that I've come across, in the winter before COVID, I was hearing time and again that from people who knew that the climate crisis was imminent and urgent, who wanted to be doing theatre, making theatre differently, but were living with the frustration that the sector as a whole was not moving forwards and changing nearly fast enough. And even then, I guess, it was clear that this is not about personal commitment. Thanks to the work of people like Julie's Bicycle and Creative Carbon Scotland, there was a huge amount of basic understanding within the sector. It wasn't about we should all be trying harder. It wasn't about if only more people knew about it, everybody knows about it. So when COVID came along, we started looking at, and we all had Zoom so we could talk to each other even though we were locked down, just trying to answer the question of what's the blocker? Why is it, if everybody wants to change, why aren't we changing? And that still seems to me the key question with how culture and other sectors respond to the climate emergency. Now, part of it was about making sense of the challenge. It's really easy to get lost in the woods. You know, what matters most? And we've heard some of those conversations this afternoon. Is it audience travel? Is it the stuff that goes on stage? Is it the lights in the foyer? And of course, I'm talking about theatre and performance in all of this. So we started out much more by good luck than by good judgment, but it's worked really effectively of saying, okay, there are three challenges here. And again, in the work we've done subsequently, this has been borne out, I think, as an effective way of of making sense, making structure of the problem, of the challenge, we said we have to make our work more sustainably, sustainable productions. We have to make our buildings sustainable, one of our biggest carbon emitters, sustainable buildings, and we have to get to grips with the rest of our operation. Audience travel, staff travel, visitor travel, running an office, running catering, running box office and marketing, running rehearsals and dressing rooms, everything else, waste, everything else that an arts organisation or a theatre does. And those have become the 3 volumes of the Theatre Green Book: sustainable productions, sustainable buildings, sustainable operations. I think the second thing we realised that has real relevance to how we make change is we knew from the outset that we had to get to a shared language and shared standards and shared guidance on sustainability. Theatre, like most art forms, but theatre, it's really, really extreme, if you like, is made by freelancers. And if they were moving from theatre to theatre, doing a show with Gemma in Glasgow, then coming and doing a show, working on a show with Alibi here, if every theatre had a different set of standards, a different methodology, calculated carbon, some didn't, whatever, it would be impossible. We'd make no progress. The sooner we can get to a shared language and shared standards for dealing with the climate emergency, the better. So what we were realising in all of that, and I won't go into too much detail about the Theatre Green Book, it's a free resource for everybody, you can find it online, is that it wasn't about individual change, it was about systems change. It was about looking at everything, all of the systems that make up theatre productions and operations, and seeing how they needed to change to move differently. And almost the key thing we learned is that this is about collaboration. When you make a theatre production, it's about a whole number of people, a producer, a director, a designer, a production manager, a set builder, and so on, all working together in ways that are incredibly interlocked, and you have to change the system. And there are other things that became clear about the importance of collaboration. We don't have time to keep reinventing the wheel. We don't have time for people to be working this out from first principles by themselves, and there's no need to do that because there is really good resource. I hope that the Theatre Green Book is part of the resource being put together by practical theatre makers across the sector, and there's other great stuff out there, Creative Carbon Scotland, Julie's Bicycle. Nobody needs to start from square one by themselves, and nobody needs to tackle this challenge alone. We can keep learning from each other, and if we don't, we're going to run out of time, even worse than we already are. And I think the other thing that sits with that is that this is a really steep learning curve, changing how we make work. In theatre, yes, but also changing the mode of operation of museums and galleries, changing how music works. Name any sector and it's the same, changing how you make work if you're a ceramist, for example. With all of those, this is a steep learning curve, and we're only going to rise up it if we can learn from each other, share best practice in a really quick and efficient kind of way. So that brings us on to the vital importance of networks, but I'll start with a caveat, and this is just a sort of learning from the last couple of years, is that I don't think it's true, given our lack of resource and energy and the danger of getting distracted, I don't think it's true that every conversation is worth investing in. We need to make sure that the networks we're working with and throwing our energy into are ones that are going to have real impact and real effect. And that, I think, is to do with the scale on which change can happen. And to go back to that example of making a theatre production, if you try to change it on the scale of the individual, you can't make change because everybody is closely interlinked. If you try to make it on too big a scale, everybody will lose interest and lose connection. So you have to find the right scale on which to work. And I think we've discovered two, I guess, types of network that have seemed to us to be really, really effective. And one, of course, are artful networks. One of the reasons in which the Greenberg has spread really quickly through theatre is fantastically well networked. Of the other sectors that I know quite well, I know that classical music is very, very well networked. I know that museums and galleries are well networked. Libraries are well networked. Wherever you've got those sector networks, then information, best practice, standards that everybody is starting to use can all be shared and spread very quickly indeed. So those are really worth building on, we've discovered. But I think the other kind of network which can be really valuable are regional networks. And GMAST, which Simon was talking about earlier, is a really great example of a cross-artful network which is regionally co-located, which can therefore work incredibly effectively to help each other towards sustainability. I'm going to talk about how in a little bit. And one of the things, of course, that they can do is have a connection with regional government and therefore start having an impact on policy in a way that I know has happened in Manchester in a really joined up way and potentially can happen elsewhere. And I think there are some really good other examples of regional networks, and picking up on one of the questions that came up earlier of how granular is it, what's the scale? I don't think I know enough to give a really useful answer, but my instinct would be that that can be really variable. You know, sometimes there can be real advantage in going down quite small, and sometimes the network can be quite large. I was talking the other morning to a What Next group, which I think, and I was trying to remember earlier whether it was South Wales or all of Wales, but I think it was all of Wales, and it was a really great, energetic group that had common purpose, had a sense of common identity and of ownership of issues. And on that scale, it was working really well. The other network that I'm involved in, because I help them convene a bit, which is quite recent, is a South Bank network, which is bringing together, in Lambeth, where I live, is bringing together the National Theatre and the South Bank Centre and the BFI and the Tate and the Globe and Somerset House, even though it's on the North Bank of the Thames. And there you've got a lot of organisations that are in quite different art forms, but they're all co-located, they all have similar relations, they're all dealing with quite similar audiences in some ways. They're all dealing with large buildings, they all have similar connections with the Mayor's Office and the Greater London Authority. So that's a valuable network, and we're making some really good progress in them learning from each other. And so those co-located, those geographical regional networks, I think are the other ones that are really worth fostering, and I really hope that that's something that can continue to grow as a result of today. What makes them work? Again, I'll just share what has sort of occurred to me in having all of these conversations over the last couple of years. But I think I'd take something from the focus groups with which we put together, as a sector, with which we put together the Theatre Green Book. And there we were bringing together groups of, for example, producers and stage designers and directors and people who run buildings and people who run front of house. So they all had points of contact with each other. They had shared language and shared interests. But we were making sure that we were making those groups as varied as possible. So we were making sure that if we had the RSC or the National Theatre in any of the groups, we would also make sure we had somebody who was coming from a small rural touring company, for example. We would make sure we were drawing people from across the United Kingdom. We would make sure we were bringing different perspectives, that we were mixing established stage designers with emerging artists and so on. And those points of difference were incredibly valuable, because at the same time, people knew how to speak to each other, but they were also learning from very, very different experiences. And although we hadn't predicted it, we discovered that there was a fantastic form of communication where, to take that example, it was on large scale, in large scale organisations, that you could find the resource to put together things like carbon calculators. You'd find organisations that would have specialist staff members who did nothing but manage catering organisations, for example. But it was on the small scale that you were finding nearly all of the creative thinking about how to do more with less. Because, of course, with squeezed resources, that's what many small-scale companies have always learned how to do. And that dialogue, that respectful dialogue, was the basis of a strong network. So what can they do? Just briefly, and this is really a learning from the networks that I've been quite directly involved with, and I hope that we can expand on this as we talk outside theatre in a minute, and Feimatta, go to you and your experience in Manchester and so on. But I think that it can be hard for cross-art form networks to share that much about the actual work itself. There's a lot of difference between making a sustainable theatre production and doing a lot of what others of you in the room will do, what might happen in other art forms. There may be links, materials, whatever, but that can be quite limited. Buildings, operations, honestly, the change in art form does not make that much difference. And so anyone who has a building can learn from each other. Anyone who's audience facing, in other words, whether you're getting an audience in to a museum or for a festival or for a performance in a building, you're all tending to work in same ways, in similar ways in how you message, how you incentivize travel and all the rest of it. I think networks, getting onto tangible points about what networks can do, is they can share best practice. So if somebody, for example, has come up with really creative thinking about how to incentivize audience travel in a particular region, then that's something that everybody in the network can learn from, can copy straight away. They can share forms of measurement. It was a really good, interesting conversation earlier about measurement, and there are things you can measure, particularly with travel, particularly with buildings. And if everybody in the network is starting to measure things in the same way, to the extent that you can measure, then yes, you can learn from each other and you can share. Expertise is another really important thing. If there's an organisation or an individual in the network who has a particular expertise, who's done some research into sustainable freight travel or whatever it might be, that's something that the whole network can benefit from and can share from. The big one, of course, is resource. And the assets, Gemma was talking about the way in which the Scottish theatres share assets and have learned how to share assets. That can be incredibly important. And of course, they can be assets of other kinds as well that people can share in order not to have to double up, not to have to waste valuable storage space because everybody has the same cherry picker or whatever it might be. That's the sort of example from the bigger scale. But, can you, if you're working in making, are there tools? Is there equipment? Is there places for storage or whatever it might be that you might be able to share so as collectively to have a smaller footprint on the earth? I think there can be some advantages, although this is a bit untested yet, but we've talked about it quite a lot, in procurement, in networks being able to procure collectively. And that might mean something like expertise. So, for example, if there are a number of members of the network who do operate buildings of whatever sort, it doesn't have to be a big theatre or a big gallery, it might just be a workshop or a rehearsal space or whatever, then it may be that those members of the network can club together and buy some professional expertise to give advice on making all of their buildings more sustainable or surveying them or whatever, more cheaply than they could individually. And then there are some examples, though I'd love to hear of more, but there are some examples, for example, of collective energy purchasing, which will start to bring down the costs of green energy. So there are tangible things like that networks can do together. And the last one I've got in my notes, again, I hope that in the conversation we'll come to some more, is around the potential for collective fundraising as a network. We talked earlier a bit about money and some of the costs of making our work, our premises and everything else more sustainable. And particularly for small organisations to club together as a network and do a collective fundraising application to get funding for green initiatives seems to be a really, really promising thing. that's all the just experience that I'd want to share about networks, and I hope that gives those of you who are coming from outside theatre a little bit more background on the Theatre Green Book as well. What I'm going to do next is just go round each of our panellists in turn and ask you each just to talk a little bit about yourselves and what you do and your organisation for sort of 5 minutes each, and then we'll go into a bit of a conversation about networking and working together. So Chloe, can I start with you?
Yeah. Firstly, thank you very much for inviting me to join in. I feel like I'm surrounded by amazing people who have been doing amazing work, and it's just extraordinarily interesting and exciting. So I am the founder of the Art and Energy Collective, which is a group of makers, thinkers, tinkerers, artists who want to use our skills to respond to the climate emergency. And the founders have a background in renewable energy, making, in natural infrastructure, ecology, engagement, and that sort of thing. So I suppose what we're trying to do is to inspire creativity, empower the people that we work with to respond to the climate emergency, and to ourselves operate in as green a way as we possibly can. We specialise in designing participatory art activities, and probably the biggest one that we've done so far was a project called Moths to a Flame, which over COVID and beyond involved 58,000 participants across the UK and overseas in creating a mass participation artwork for COP. And it took 18 months to develop it because COP was delayed, but the result of it was that we learned quite a lot about how to engage people in creativity around climate change issues. So we produced a framework, which I'm very happy to share, which we call our compass, which outlines what we think are essential for engaging people, engaging their creativity and helping them to overcome some of the barriers to responding to the climate emergency. So as an example, some of the major barriers I think we all face are eco-anxiety in its various forms, and it's our view that and nearly everyone experiences eco-anxiety, and in our definition it ranges from everything from denial that climate change you through to needing perfection about your carbon calculator before you're willing to do anything. So that is the spectrum of eco-anxiety. We think that we need to help ourselves and our communities overcome that, and that creativity is a really good medium to help people make their own journeys through. Burnout is another of the major hurdles that we come across, with people not having enough time, energy or resource to be able to respond. And so doing things in a way that's really simple, giving people frameworks and support to take small actions, creates that kind of active place for people to begin to be able to feel more able to join in with each other and know about what's going on. Looking to I suppose fragmentation of our communities is another of the major issues, and I think that that's been kind of well talked about here, in that, you know, this is a theatre sector, which is a silo of sorts within another silo of the culture sector, and the siloed nature of our culture, the lack of cohesion in our culture, the divisions within our culture are a major barrier. And I suppose history as well, the kind of our inheritance, those are barriers to us responding to the climate emergency. So I've already talked about the fact that we're a tiny organisation, and that's great. It means that we can't do things like have a really great carbon calculator where every piece of thing that we do is measured ad infinitum, and we would love to be able to do that. We have taken the view that celebrating action and being positive is more important than record keeping about how much carbon we're using. In a way, recognising that all carbon calculators are flawed in some way, we've decided to step out of that and decide that, in fact, even just calculating carbon is kind of depressing and boring. So it's our view that we need to count and celebrate and share every positive action that we take. So, and that's asking, and you know, that's recognizing that we're never going to get to the end point probably within our lives, but that we've just got to make progress, and the best way of making progress is with positive energy. We are about to launch a thing called burythegiant.club, which is an online social and learning platform for anyone who wants to be creative in response to the climate emergency. And the idea is that any organisation, creative organisation, can create simple provocations that can start dialogue and enable all of us as a culture to begin that positive creative journey, and that kind of social network may be able to support that journey. And I suppose my final thing that I wanted to say is that we look to nature, I suppose, for inspiration. We looked to moths and moths' relationship with flames to help us understand a bit about our addictive nature to energy and our dependency on energy systems, and how detrimental that is to ourselves and how detrimental that is to the natural world. It was a very useful metaphor. And How to Bury a Giant is inviting participants to look at mosses and the tiny worlds of mosses that are on many people's doorsteps. They're all on every continent of the world. And mosses have been here for 450 million years, and they tell a story of persistence and survival. And they also tell a story about carbon sequestration and capturing carbon, and of tininess and smallness. And we think that there's something really exciting about telling a story about tiny actions making a difference. You know, mosses have changed our climate, and we can change our climate. We have changed our climate. We can learn from mosses to change our climate again. And I mean, I do recognise that we are in a system that needs changing. So there is tension between the kind of individual action thing and the responsibility that we have as cultural organisations to change culture, which means systemic interest. So my suggestion is that we need to be interested in the nitty-gritty, but we also need to be interested in the political systemic issues that we're facing.
And that, I guess, thanks so much for that. And that, I guess, as partly how networks can start to help and come together. Kalkidan, do you want to give us a sort of 5-minute introduction to yourself and your organisation and what you do?
Of course. Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. My name is Kalkidan. I am a social entrepreneur. I've been working in fashion and sustainable fashion predominantly for the past 10 years, straight out of university. And I have spent this past decade creating various businesses that help me to, present a solution to, one of the social, cultural, and environmental problems that I was seeing. I have a shop called Sancho's in Exeter, and there we sell sustainable fashion. And for us, what that means is the garment is made with organic and biodegradable materials, and that to the point of political necessity and social environmentalism as well, is made in a fair trade way where garment workers are paid living wages and they can bargain for safe working environments. Sancho's is a wonderful business with a great kind of community base and has seen success, I guess, over the past few years or so. But that wasn't always the case. When we first started, the real challenge was communicating to people that sustainable fashion had a role to play in their own vision for their impact on the world, and the choices that they had to shape a more environmentally and socially sound world. And the way we were able to create that purpose in the minds of our customers and beyond was really through really focused and very personal community engagement, and doing what we could to really root ourselves in our community in Exeter and then digitally beyond. So that looked like, from an arts and performance perspective, that looked like talks and things like this, where we would do our best to educate people. It looked like a lot of writing, a lot of copy, a lot of blogs, a lot of videos. It looked like the Slow Fashion Show, which we held biannually at the Cathedral at Exeter, where 700 designers and passionate people, shoppers, would come and witness our sustainable fashion runways. And the reason we were able to succeed, because of course the odds were against us, because our product was more expensive than its counterpart on the high street. We had less choice, we had much less variety of products that we can offer people, much less marketing spend and resources to kind of sell those items. The reason we're able to succeed is because we're able to tap into the potential of community and networks, and really showing people that they are connected to garment workers, in the global south and in the Far East. They are related to the consequences of pollution all around the world. They are related to factory workers throughout the UK, and it's through that relation that they then begin to understand how compassionate they can be to what that supply chain should look like, and then how they should address the choices they have around shopping, and then we're able to present our product as a solution to them. So I think that one thing that I'm really passionate about is the role of community in not just artistic cultural change, but also in establishing businesses and industry that can tackle some of the environmental and social challenges that we face. I think it's absolutely essential, because frankly these businesses on paper don't make that much sense. And then there is this kind of, I'm sure everyone here has some sense of the problem with fashion, but the way I see it is that the critical issue is that it's linear. This is something that I realised at Sancho's. When you get to the point where you're selling hundreds of thousands of products, and you can see on paper that your growth model is to sell more products. So the question, okay, well, is this the final goal? The issue with fashion is that it's linear. Products are produced to be sold, and ideally the goal for most fashion businesses is to sell more products, so that consumers, and in order to sell more products, they need to create a demand from consumers in order to purchase more. But the problem is those items become underutilized, and then they sit idle either in a person's home or in local charity shops, whereby 80% of what sits in charity shops is never sold, or is it exported to countries like Ghana or Chile, where huge volumes of fashion is treated like waste and destroys ecosystems. So currently we send 18 garbage trucks full of fashion waste into landfill every second, and this is because the industry is really set up to produce more. And obviously that's a huge problem. And the problem, from a monetary perspective, it costs the global economy £500 billion per year. These are products that have value, but aren't in the market in a way in which their value can be unlocked, so they're treated as waste. So I've got a question for everybody. Who has a pile of clothes somewhere in their home that either has holes in and need repairs, or they haven't worn for 3 years and they need to take to a charity shop, or they were thinking of listing onto Vinted? Hands up.
I'm sure everybody does, and we might come back to that question afterwards, but I want to give time for Feimatta as well to introduce.
If I can just finish very quickly. So all of those items we feel could one man's trash could be another man's treasure. But the question is, how do you really get them back into circulation? So my latest startup, OWNI, we funded up to £500,000 in order to build this tool, is to automate the product information around ownership, to really make that transaction of goods we don't use absolutely frictionless. And maybe I'll tell you a bit about it later.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks so much for that. And I particularly want to pick up, because we've been asked to talk about networks, to pick up on the point you were making about engagement with communities and stuff. We're going to circle back to that once we've talked a little bit about networks within culture and among our organisations. But before that, Feimatta, do you want to talk quickly about yourself and what you do?
Hello, I'm Feimatta Conteh, and I'm realising I should actually update the thing that it says on my screen there, because it says MIF, but actually yesterday we did the launch and we are now Factory International. Woo! So so I'm a little bit tired, so apologies if I can't sort of stay on tangent. So yes, I'm the Environmental Sustainability Manager, and I started working at MIF exactly 2 years ago. And we are in this transition towards, we are now transitioned to being Factory International. And that's part of our transition from being a festival that happens in Manchester every 2 years under the title of 18 Extraordinary Days, to operating a venue called Factory International, which opens next summer. So we'll then have a year-round programme and continue to do the festival every 2 years. So next year is going to be a real head-melting time. I'm the first full-time sustainability manager in the organisation, which I think is quite significant, and everyone was very excited when I arrived. And then I, in my sort of slightly tongue-in-cheek way, I was like, hey guys, this isn't the first time I've had that job title, because about 10 years or so ago, I was the sustainability projects manager at a small theatre in East London called Arcola Theatre, which I realise now is kind of look back and like, oh yeah, we were quite groundbreaking. Oh right, what we thought was normal was probably quite unusual for a lot of organisations at the time. And that's partly because we combined the business of running a theatre and trying to do that in the most sustainable way as possible with also running a organisation that did research and development around hydrogen fuel cells called Arcola Energy. So I transitioned then from working predominantly on the theatre stuff to actually then becoming the programme manager for the R&D projects in that technology development. So it'd be really interesting, Chloe, kind of talking with you about kind of renewable energies and those things, and some of the thoughts I had around that, and just learning different languages to kind of express things in. Sorry, that's a long load of waffle. So yes, I'm now in this position at Factory International. And people will have met Simon earlier this morning, and I helped facilitate the GMAS network with Simon, because one of the things I feel, and my colleague who's our director of creative engagement told me when I was sort of starting the job, is like, as an organisation, we are one of the largest organisations in Manchester, if not the Northwest. I think one of the things in a press release yesterday was Factory International is the largest investment in a cultural venue since the Tate in 2000. So that gives you a sense of sort of the scale of what we're going in. So it's kind of, with the level of public subsidy that we get, and it's by no means all of our funding comes from Arts Council or the local authority, there's a kind of bit on us that feels incumbent to sort of, what can we do for the sector beyond the bounds of our organisation? Like, how do we share our resources, be they us as people, or what we have access to? How do we put that to the service of the people of Manchester and of Greater Manchester? So I've kind of taken that into how I go about doing my job, because being a full-time sustainability manager is almost kind of it's a real privilege, I think, in this space. So how can I connect and share what we're doing and learn from other people, and be a conduit to kind of pass that information and knowledge, not just around Manchester and Greater Manchester, but across sectors and all of that. And I think predominantly that's because I do like talking to people. I like hearing ideas, sharing knowledge, and all of those things. And I'm always up for a natter. So I think that's probably all I'll say to introduce myself. And I look forward to having great chats with Chloe and Kalkidan. Apologies if I don't always get your name right, but I'm trying to solve it here. And actually, I was just thinking, actually, Paddy, as we start in this, because I remember making contact with you as the Green Book was starting out, sort of, I think January 21, I think we first made a telephone conversation. So it feels really nice that the development of that has sort of run in parallel with my time at MIF. And I think a reflection that I would have is like from, 10 years ago working at Arcola to now working at MIF, it's like everybody's got the memo now. Like, it's no longer about people going, oh, we're the first production to do this or that. It's just more like, yeah, why aren't you doing it? And so I think, resources like Theatre Green Book have really helped with that. And it is just more about, this is just how we do things now.
And I think that would be a really good place actually to start this conversation about networks, and we'll start small and go wider. But just, going back to the start of your time at Arcola, which was really pioneering. I think, we've all looked back on that and learned from it so much. And what's your sense of the networks that you've been part of that have really helped spread sustainability and maybe got real traction and made real difference?
So I guess looking back at that time, like what was that? I remember, sorry, I'm trying to like remember back over 10 years and having had a baby in between times. Were there really many networks and things around? I remember some conversations around sort of the London Theatre Consortium and things like that. But I think it was much more kind of networks going, oh, let's talk about sustainability a bit, rather there being sustainable focused networks. I remember hearing about MAST as it was when and I moved back to Manchester in about 2016, and at that time MAST didn't have a website or anything like that. And I think, sorry, now this is going broader than the sector, I think there might have been more networks like sort of transition town things and more sort of community-based stuff rather than things specifically in the sector. So I'm just thinking about what Kalkidan was just talking about, and maybe what Chloe's was sensing, like there is that importance of how we connect to our communities and the places that we're in. And maybe that's something that's quite rich and that we can dig into rather than just focusing on sort of the work that we do. Sorry, I don't know.
I think let's sort of get the work that we do out of the way, if you see what I mean, and then we can come back to that. But so for example, are you at the factory in contact with other similar, there aren't that many similar organisations, but other similar organisations around the world, within the UK or whatever, in helpful ways? I mean, of course, you have some contact with them, but in helpful ways.
That's a really interesting point, and you made me go, oh, why aren't we? Like I've had conversations, so it's awkward questions that everyone always asks is how can an international festival aim to be sustainable when you're flying people around the world? It's like, yes, that's an awkward question, but let's carry on and try doing it. And what I'm thinking of is in the sustainability policy that I've written for the organisation, I've taken the 5 values that we say that we have, which off the top of my head is open, equitable, inventive, determined and international. And thinking about that international thing, I had a sentence which is about how climate change is a global phenomenon, and what we'll try and do is use our international networks to try and affect change globally. But as yet, I haven't yet sort of picked that up and had those conversations about who can we connect with. I made a note just now about the South Bank network that you were involved with, to be like, oh, maybe we can connect with that. So what I think, because we're not in the venue yet, I haven't switched my mind to thinking about that. But a network that I've been part of that is developed over the last year or so has been built by somebody called Mark Denby, who's head of production at Norfolk and Norwich, and he's convening a network of organisations that create work festivals in urban spaces, because we know there's lots of networks like Vision 2025 and things like that that's around greenfield festivals and things. But Mark was feeling like space to create a network where people are doing work in urban spaces in relationship with local authorities and have various kind of constraints or challenges that we don't have in the greenfield sector. So that's bringing together MIF, Norfolk and Norwich Festival, the Cheltenham festivals, festivals in Brighton and things. So that's kind of organically developed over the last year, and it's a really interesting place to share things from GMAS, from the Theatre Green Book, and sort of pass it through. I think somebody used the phrase before, rhizomatic networks, and I think that's what it's about. It's about how you can share knowledge and wisdom, as Simon was talking about before, you know, cross-sector, cross-region, and it's almost like taking from each network and each thing whatever's useful for the work that you're doing for your practice, and letting everything else kind of float by, you know?
It's sort of triaging, isn't it? It's working out what's going to be helpful and what isn't. And I suspect that often the most effective networks kind of grow organically, you know, exactly as you're saying. Kalkidan, again, just starting narrow, are there other sustainable fashion organisations that you're networked with, and is that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a ton. To be honest, what I was thinking is how, I think the challenge with kind of a network approach is how easy it is to duplicate activities. And so we in Sancho's, we had to learn that, you know, educating on sustainable fashion didn't need to be our specialism. You know, at the time I felt like, well, that's what we'll do, this will be part of our marketing activity. But then there are, you know, some fantastic networks like Fashion Revolution, which is across 182 countries. It's a charitable organisation which focuses on fashion education. There's the name escapes me, Slow Factory, which is a US-based education resource. They provide free and open education around the intersections between fashion and race and gender and class. And I think one of the learnings for us was, okay, so there's participation, and then there's coordination, and then there's leadership, and it's like really understanding what role to play in different spaces. And I think where there's really fantastic work, I think so much of our jobs in climate change management is learning how to be like really good followers and really good supporters of, you know, what has been built. And the unfortunate challenge, I think, is because of resource scarcity, both in like the art sector and in business. I think sometimes you have organisations or networks competing for whether it's like resources of financial resources or just attention, which can raise the quality of work that everybody produces. So yeah, that's one of the lessons we've learned.
And are there local networks in Exeter or in the Southwest or whatever that you're part of that are also sustaining and supportive and valuable?
Yeah, so I've spent the past 2 years building software. So I've like had a very they call it like goblin core, like in my room in the dark, trying to figure out this digitalization like business model. So I really fell out of networks. But I know there's an organisation called Ethical Exeter. There's various vegan groups that have various overlap. There's various race relation groups. The university has amazing societies. So yeah, but my personal participation in them has been somewhat limited. And I think that's okay too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And is there what would you, if you were to have more time, energy, resource, whatever, to engage with networks, what would you want from them, if you see what I mean?
I think the important thing is to actually move the needle forward, is to really identify what you can do to make an organisation or an individual live in a more kind of environmentally and socially conscious way, and then do that action. So if I were to support these institutions, which I will, I will. In fact, it's one of my things on my to-do list. I want to start volunteering again. It would be simply to push the needle forward. I think that's one of the things I think entrepreneurship teaches you is, fundamentally you need to get things done, and I think that that skill set is something that you have to specialise in business, but you don't necessarily have to specialise in, even in education or in various sectors. So I would focus on that. So that could look like in Exeter. It could look like we have this huge transport issue whereby the city is just really inaccessible for most people. We have housing challenges. We need like better recycling. We need food waste collections. We obviously need to kick a political party out. Not necessarily.
They're doing that for themselves.
That's true. Thank goodness. Yeah, I think a lot of things. But I think my kind of specialism is like looking at identity.
Chloe, are there within culture, as it were, using the term in a sort of broad, inaccurate kind of way, are there conversations that are valuable to you in your work and that help you in your work? And what is it that you're getting from them, I guess?
So when I first started out in the art and energy space, this was in 2012, and the only way I was getting information was by looking for the network. There wasn't a network. So I was looking at Arcola and feeling very inspired. I did, and I was looking at Land Art Generator Initiative, which was inspiring. And over time, I've collected about 150 examples of different people doing work in the art and energy space over time, which is really cool. And I suppose, you know, the point of the network, the point of that was about trying to be aware of what other people were doing. But there's only so much capacity that one has, a network has, to share that knowledge and to receive that knowledge. So things like Art and Energy, How Culture Changes by Barry Lord, which was an amazing book that was produced, I think it's 15 years ago, that was saying that there will be changes in the way that art is produced because of the way culture is changing. So that was an epic collecting of a sense of what might happen in the future. And I think that there's something, for me, that's something that I really need from a network, is those conversations about how we can collaborate going forward. So the places I'm getting it at the moment are, you know, from the lovely ecology that we've built up around ourselves, that kind of activist doing something, trying to make stuff work. But there's no formal network around that. There is the SEI here, which you know, Emma's doing some great work bringing people in the culture sector in Devon together. But I personally haven't found my ways into that properly, and that's just, you know, that's on me, lack of capacity, burnout, not knowing how to engage, that sort of thing.
But when it comes then starting to look a bit wider on the other kinds of engagement that we need to make, it's not just about us, it's not just about artists in a traditional sense and makers in a traditional sense, which was something you were talking to me about earlier, and that need to talk more widely. Do you want to just talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so Art and Energy works very closely with community energy groups, and it's my feeling that every cultural organisation should be connected with their community energy group. I think it's really essential, because if you're wanting local knowledge about what's happening around energy in your locality, they are the people who are best connected with that. And I suppose on that, they are a vehicle in which you can tangibly make a difference. So, for example, we were talking about carbon offsetting earlier, and how meaningless some of the carbon offsetting offers are out there, and how maybe it's better just to put the money into your own practice and evolve what you're doing. But if people genuinely do want to be given opportunities to make a difference, we are, and I'm kind of surprised it's not come up yet because of the context for theatre, and I know theatre is particularly hit hard by this, but the energy crisis is not going away, and there are, you know, countless people descending into fuel poverty every day, and this is not going to get any better. And so responding to those who are in fuel poverty not being able to afford to do things that reduce their energy bills is a real way of offsetting carbon emissions. So, for instance, if you can, if a home can be insulated, that is tangible measurable, immediate carbon reduction that can be done. So those relationships with those community energy groups who are delivering that work gives you a vehicle by which you can do your own carbon offsetting. Yeah. And so, for instance, you know, you can, instead of paying, well, anyone who wants to know more about carbon offsetting community energy groups, please come and talk to me another time, because I but those sorts of relationships, I think that as standard, arts organisations need to be not so much worrying about each other and more concerned about connecting with their local community and supporting local action. So the community energy group, the ecology group, the environmental group, the fashion groups, the people who are trying very hard to make a difference in our communities, who can really benefit from that shared cross-sector understanding. When I mean, everyone knows this, when you're in a silo, you can kind of go down rabbit holes. You can kind of get caught up in the sort of language that you're in. And the moment that you go into sector, the moment that you kind of cross disciplines, you're suddenly able to access so much more information, so much more goodwill. And so for me, that's a really important thing that we should all be doing. Like we should be building it into our boards. You know, we should be sitting on the boards of our local green groups. And we should, very importantly, I don't know whether anyone else has noticed this, in like 5 towns locally, community climate centres have opened up. Like, that's like I mean, 5 in the last 3 months. And so I would suggest that we get very closely connected with those.
Sorry, I just wanted to add to a close you're saying there. I'm really pleased to report that, I mean, I don't know, it's a long way off, but there's an action in my 5-year environmental sustainability action plan, which is about connecting with local community energy groups, because kind of thinking about how can we use the factory building, not just to kind of, to, you know, engage our audiences around sustainability, but how do we connect with people who are already doing this work in that area? And I know in our creative engagement department, one of my colleagues who I get on with very well, her job is community partnerships manager. So thinking about how we as an organisation can partner with community groups, but also in that partnering, really acknowledge things around power and dynamics and things like that, and how we can break those down so that as an organisation we can connect into those networks, but not kind of just arriving as here we are as a big organisation doing things, but how we can sit humbly and listen and do that. So no, just wanted to share that point.
I'm listening to you talking, Feimatta. I'm remembering a conversation I was having with somebody who runs Wakefield Theatre. And I was talking in a slightly sort of rough and ready way about connecting with community, and she stopped and corrected me and said it's connecting with communities. You know, it's no longer the case in most towns that you have a single and coherent community. You have intersecting, interlocking and overlapping communities, plural, with whom in a complex way you need to be connecting. Kalkidan, you were talking earlier about how important it was to engage with the communities and change the community in order to have a relationship with them. How did that sort of start? What was the starting process for it?
I think one day we realised that we needed to make some money.
That's always a real start.
Oh, the other sustainability, yes.
Yeah, and then the question was, okay, well, how do we make money? And then you realise, okay, this is a question of volume somewhat. And then we started asking ourselves, how do we create a habit for the customers in this community, or our target customer, to see Sancho's as like the place to go when they need something, or they would like something? How do we have Sancho's on their top of their head? So like before they go to M&S or Zara, they'll come to Sancho's to see if we have it. And then the question become, you know, what cultural habits could we create that would you know, instill that kind of behaviour amongst our community and audiences. And that looked like a whole host of different things, from like what I call content marketing. Forgive me, I feel like my language is from a different like world, I'm sorry, but a bit dull, but yeah, like content marketing, events marketing, like certain promotions. I think there was a call for like a lot of vulnerability from me and our team. So there was, you know, that kind of invitation for value sharing and to connect with people on the basis of value. But yeah, in summary, essentially it's you're trying to create a habit. So the question is, you know, what actions can you take to create that habit? Most habitual behaviours need to have a level of frequency. So it's not how do I get someone to come to a show, for example, it's how do I get someone to come to the local theatre every Friday as part of their entertainment and lifestyle. And then the answers to that question really like lay out the activities that need to be carried out. But the great thing about habits is that they're really hard to like break. So once it's created, there's like a foundation that can last for longer. So that's how we did it. And yeah.
I mean, that's so sort of, again, inspiring for the idea of networks, that there's so much in that it seems to me that other parts of the cultural world could learn from, you know, in how to change mindsets in order to change expectations in order that they will want what
I think it helps to like understand what people's motivations are and to be honest about what their motivations are, and to position yourself in line with those motivations. I think that the challenging path to take is when you can't identify like an incentive structure that is suitable for you and your audience. So the question is, you know, what do people need? What do they want? Like, say right now, people need community, they need solutions, they need home, they need entertainment. Personally, I feel like there's a kind of reading from COVID still. Obviously, the illness is still out there, but the kind of lifestyle changes that we took. And I think there is a real need for people to feel like they belong somewhere. I think it's finding that need and then positioning your service or solution or product in alignment with that. And then from a network perspective, I think it's about networks. I don't know how to end that, sorry.
Jump back in if it lands. But what I think is really inspiring is that you're never talking about what you do independent of the people you're doing it for and with, which plays back to Chloe's point about it's all very well to talk about this in silos, but actually no, we've got to see it in a way that's interlocked with the people we're working with.
And sorry, I think from a climate change perspective, the challenges, the way we live our lives now are not sustainable. Like, you know, we use too much of the planet's resources. So we have to all change our lives probably incredibly drastically. Like, you know, which countries are within the planetary boundaries, you know, countries like Moldova and Ethiopia and India and you know, think about the breadth of lifestyle change that's required for us to be within the regenerative resource pool. So I think the opportunity for cultural leaders is to begin to illustrate to people what that lifestyle is, and then give people bridges so that they can go from how they're living now to that way of living. I think that's the opportunity for cultural change.
Yeah, absolutely. And can I ask? Well,
I've just got a comment to share on that for what Kalkidan was just saying about kind of imagine the futures, and it's, I guess, sort of thinking about if we so Factory International, we've developed a new vision for the organisation, which is it's where we invent tomorrow together, and it's like, are we actually going to be really serious about that and be like, how are we going to have the conversations about what our futures look like? When is it? How are we going to embody that so it's not just a vision statement that's up there? Because one of the things I really like about it as a vision statement is that there's an implied invitation in it. It's that we don't have all the answers on our own. We need to be working together with people to do that. But it's how can we actually manifest that when we're within the form of what people perceive as a large cultural institution and building, with money and power in it. So yeah, that's a conversation that discussions that we'll be having in there, but it is about how we can come together and start thinking about what the future might look like.
Yeah.
I wonder,
Please
can
do.
I ask us a question? Like, you know, obviously we're doing what we can do within the parameters of what we can do, and that will take us a certain way on the journey. And Kalkidan's pointing to the mega changes that need to be made, which, you know, are really, really, like, none of us can probably even imagine how we'll do it. It's a creative exploration for us as a culture to write that future together. And it's quite ambitious to hold that vision of the future, especially as the changes that need to happen are not just our organisation changes or our communities changes, it's actually the power structures that we are living within, that we have a certain capacity to either ignore and do our own thing, or vote for something different, but not with any guarantees that it will actually be different. And, you know, like we were talking about mega capitalist institutions that have, you know, like, where do they get the incentive to move? And I just wonder, do we see cultural institutions having a role in that? Do we see cultural institutions as being important? Or are we so dependent on funding that we couldn't book a boat?
Let's ask the factory.
Should I just say no? No, I don't. It's those moments, isn't it, Chloe, when you look at it and you go like, oh, is that what we're talking about? And I just remember somebody in the last session talking about, you know, with a capitalism, really, isn't it? It's like, are we willing to say that we want to see the end of, and then you're like, oh, but we are dependent on ticket sales, aren't we? And, you know, and Kalkidan, you were talking before then about that linear process of like the mission is always to do more and more and more and more. And you're like, but surely we have to give up on that, because now our mission is not to do that. Our mission is to regenerate and step away from it. I don't have any answers. It's 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon.
And rather than try and solve capitalism in 10 minutes, I think because I want to come to some questions if there are some coming in. I mean, I think all one would say is you wouldn't start from here if you want to get to somewhere more sustainable. Have we got some questions?
It was just a comment that, you know, there have been great moves in that direction of pulling out sponsorship from oil sponsorship, and there are things, there's messaging that can come through those cultural institutions. It might be about where the funding comes from. It might be, and yes. So.
I mean, I think the other thing that occurs to me is how changeable culture is. You know, the whole point of culture is that it changes and reinvents itself. Not always easily, because culture can get stuck in the mud as well, as we know. But it can change itself. And I'm just remembering, actually, when you were talking, Kalkidan, and I'll come to you in a second, but I was just remembering there was a sort of Southwest Day in Bath, which Roberta and Javon organised, and we were talking about, it was a theatre thing, we were talking about set making, you know, and the sort of thing we were talking about this morning about how much could you recycle, could you find material alternatives, whatever. And there was just a brilliant question, do you remember this from the audience, when a dancer from Ethiopia, who trained and had done his work there, stood up and said, why do you keep talking about sets? You know, I don't dance on, why don't you just not have sets, kind of? And it was a brilliant sort of, you know, that doesn't mean that all the performance is now going to become setless, but it was just, hang on, let's frame this in something much bigger and say, your first choice was to make a set, not how you make it. And I think those sorts of rethinkings of how we work is something that culture at its best has the ability to do, while of course it can also get very, very stuck in certain mindsets. Are there any questions,
There are no questions
online? Otherwise, is there anybody in the room outside? Are you still there?
I think that there might be some questions, but this is just more something that I've been thinking about. There was an article this week in Arts Pro by James Mackenzie Blackmore, who's the CEO of Theatre Royal Plymouth, considering what the energy crisis actually means for TRP. You know, that the cost of energy has their bill on one day went up by 400%.
Yeah.
So that is actually what we're talking about right now. And his approach, what he was starting to articulate, was absolutely fascinating. And he said that it might actually mean that we are much more selective about the quality about our work. And we have to only be putting on the highest quality of work, because we cannot literally waste energy on things that aren't of the absolute highest quality, that isn't connecting with our audiences. And he was also talking about the Theatre Royal becoming a place for community. I think he used the word warmth in it, that it's the sort of place that you come for warmth in the middle of a winter that might be lacking in warmth for a lot of people here. And I was just really impressed by that sort of leadership and that sort of state right now, and how that was intersecting with a lot of the comments that I was hearing from the panel.
Interestingly, that's something, well, one of the things we've been doing recently is take the Theatre Green Book and expand it for buildings and expand it to other cultural sectors. It's a piece of work that Arts Council England commissioned us to do in the GLA. And it's really interesting talking to the libraries community, where library buildings are already becoming climate refuges. And traditionally, they've been places where people can go in the winter for warmth. But in the Canadian heat wave last summer, there were people going to libraries because they had aircon and it was the only place they could be cool. So the notion of all public buildings and cultural buildings, many of them are public buildings, have absolutely got a role to play in how communities become resilient against climate. I cut you off saying something earlier.
Yeah, just to make a case for the end of capitalism. Just a very quick one.
You have
No, I think sometimes we ask ourselves these questions and like put ourselves in a corner and we let ourselves get confused. But like some really impactful changes could be, raising the free tax threshold, including universal income for everybody. Investing in green energy. Like there are lots of solutions, and I think we should just like mindset-wise, we should move away from, oh my God, that's so big and scary, to I wonder what we should be asking for. Because if we can define it like ourselves, then we can begin, demanding it of the world around us. And just in fashion, so the problem that I was trying to communicate was that people buy things and then they don't use them, and then somebody else goes out and buys like a new version of the thing. So person two will buy something new that person one isn't using. So there's a real circulation problem, which is what we're trying to address with OWNI. Is £300 billion worth of products in the UK just sit idle, and it's well, can those products circulate more efficiently? £300 billion is 70% of the current retail turnover. So there is economic value in these solutions if they can be executed and delivered properly. Ending our reliance with the linear economy or worker exploitation or resource exploitation doesn't have to mean lack of prosperity for us. It's just essentially searching for that prosperity through more equitable and sustainable means. But yeah, that's what we're working on as OWNI. So I'm sure there are problems in other areas. In other
sectors. Yeah. Thank you. Is there any other comment from outside in the room? Just to make sure that people have got a chance to speak.
Yes, there is.
Very, very briefly, yesterday I heard myself say something I never imagined, which is trying to articulate something about a transition from being project dependent, which is funding dependent, to having the habits that I hope the projects I deliver are instilling in people. That those habits are then we are being the change we want to be, not the project of the change that we want people to start having. Does that make sense? And it was just this kind of light bulb moment of when are we going to start doing it, not project doing it. Mm-hmm. I wanted to say, and I kind of hear something in there too, that someone's going to be. We've all got to be brave at one point and say we're doing it, but not make a project of it. So,
Oh.
Does anyone want to pick, any of you want to pick anything up from that? Lots of nodding, absolutely lots of nodding.
It's a really beautiful way of putting it, because there's always like an idea that a project will come to an end and you will go back to what you were doing before. But actually, if you're just making a change and being like, doing this now, I don't know where it's going to go to, but this is how I'm doing it now. That's a really, thank you for that framing. I really appreciate it.
One of my friends, Emma Welton, said in an event a few weeks ago that she's a musician. She said, "I'm a climate musician. I'm a climate worker." And I thought, and I'm sure that that is a thing that she's heard and shared. But I do think that we are all doing that. We're all climate workers, aren't we?
So, anything else from the room outside?
Yes.
Kindly, says Abigail.
Yes, there is.
I would like to ask guys, you mentioned quality, right? So this kind of idea of reduction and to focus on quality in theatre, and I see in here, and I'm a craft specialist, to say theatre is not my specialty, but I see something here very similar to what happened to craft and how we frame a craft object or not. Who decides quality of work? What is quality and how do we frame it? Because, I mean, this is something that now is dictated from some sort of economic capitalistic values. So if it generates a series of, income, let's say, it's quality. It's quality.
Yes.
So in that sense, it's like, I totally am on board with the idea of limits, of free growth, and I'm actually a very big promoter of that transition. But at the same time, the values that determine this transition needs to be clear. What are we talking about when we say we will just give space to quality?
I think I should probably respond to that. I think it's really important to say that I'm not the Theatre Royal Plymouth, and I actually speak on behalf of an article I read really quickly via Twitter yesterday. What I can say, though, is that I'm pretty certain that in the case of the Theatre Royal Plymouth, that quality was being used as a value system. And it's a value system that is situated within its community, and within that quality doesn't just mean the glossiness of something on stage or 5-star reviews. That quality actually has a number of interlocking criteria related to how it performs within the communities for which it is performing. And I think that's the only way we can describe quality. But what I can say is that a lot of the early conversations a year ago when I started working on projects like this was that if we started making sustainable work, then the quality was going to go down. And that's actually the irony of all this, as opposed to the quality is going to change. The way we value quality is going to change, that there's an embeddedness in it. And I know, Paddy, you've heard that over and over again, and we certainly heard about it in relation to case studies as well, that if we do this, then something won't be as good as before. So I think that I think I'm just saying that concept of quality is a really, really fraught one, but it doesn't just mean high art criteria of, by some patriarchal white system determining historical qualities, that those two are under revision. And I think that they're under revision by our cultural organizations like Theatre Royal Plymouth, and also Factory International as well.
Thanks, Roberta. That's a good. I think we're past our time, so that's a good place to stop and a good voice to stop on, because thanks so much to you, Roberta and Siobhan, and everyone else who's been involved in it for organising today. It's been a really great conversation, and thanks to Kalkidan, to Chloe, to Feimatta for being on this panel this afternoon.
Thank you, Paddy.
I feel like
So everybody on the schedule, it does say that we have like 10 minutes in which we can just sort of wrap up and look forward and say anything that we want to say. A lot of people have asked, oh, maybe, yeah, I'm not going to go in there because that would just be weird for me to go in there now. A lot of people ask how they're going to find out more about the project and the outcomes. What I can say is that almost everything we talked about today has just greatly and vastly enriched the findings of this project and has framed it in a really wonderful way. So I'm going to have to find ways to incorporate that as well. We are hoping to put an edited version, not too edited, of today online, and we're working with the Policy and Evidence Centre to find a way to do that. So probably through YouTube. So hopefully, if you suddenly think, oh, I wish I hadn't said that, please make sure that you let me or Siobhan know so we can cut you out before we
muted her.
Oh.
No, it will not let me.
Oh, you.
I'm sorry.
No.
Yeah, it's tricky because it's going through.
Don't worry, that's fine.
Okay, so you're not muted. Nobody's muted now. Okay. So what I would just like to do for the last few minutes is just to, you guys can move. You guys can move. You can come in here. Thank you. You guys are awesome. What I would just like to do is just think about, because we have so many, we've talked about such a wide range of issues, and I've made lots and lots of notes. I was just wondering if maybe we could spend a minute thinking about anything that you would want to take away. Anything that you heard, especially coming from a different sector, your theatre person that you heard, or something that you heard from a different company or a different organisation. So if there's anything, also folks at home, if there's anything that you might take away from this particular sharing, it would be really useful to know. So just to think for a minute or two whether there's anything you think that is something I can apply, that is something I can extend, that is a connection I didn't think about making before today. That would be really useful. Okay, thank you. One thing I'd like to extend is my use of Zoom in 2 rooms at the same time. Okay, so or would you like to pick up your comment from earlier, maybe?
I was going to say that the social enterprise sector, the third sector, as a network, is not something I've heard being talked about. CIC, CCUBS, COCs, there's so many different varieties, and they are quite, by nature, connected to each other. Yeah. And there are, Plymouth is one of them, and there are maybe 5 cities across the UK that receive particular funding and support to develop CIC movement or the growth. And it's over lockdowns, it's grown unbelievably big. So it's a network just waiting, it's a grassroots network waiting to be connected into
all of the things that we were talking about.
Yeah, it's a huge network and it's really well connected to itself. It's a raft and it's really quite solid and it's just waiting to be found.
One of the things I was thinking about, something that's come up over and over again in the research is actually related to Kalkidan's work, which is the connections between fast fashion and theatre are incredible. And the interesting people that I've spoken to have talked about the need for much, much closer knowledge sharing. Thank you. Anything else that people would like to pick up or say before we close for the day? No? In which case, it just leaves me to say, no, I'll face the camera. In which case, it pleases me to say thank you so much for all of you for coming to Plymouth, for sharing your knowledge, for sharing your expertise, both online and in person. There's a lot of fruit left. Please take fruit with you and anything else that is left over. We'll let you know when it goes online. We have everybody's email addresses who registered for today and can point you to any of the outcomes of this project and what we're finding out. And hopefully very soon, our 3 case studies of productions and the various reports and blogs that we're all writing. So I just want to thank you. I really, really want to thank Low Carbon Devon, who is pouring this house all day. I love this building. And it's felt like a really productive and encouraging and inspirational and moving and just thank you. Thank you all for being here and for participating.